Good afternoon. Welcome to the Director Seminar Series at the Fairbanks Center. I am Winnie Yip, an Interim Director of the Fairbanks Center. One of the functions of the Fairbanks Center is to provide a place and a platform for scholars to come together to share their work and their research that are of common interest for all of those who are interested in China. And one of the goals that we want to achieve in the coming year is also to encourage more young scholars to be part of our intellectual community. Therefore, in the spring series, we have invited a few young scholars, and I call them rising stars in the area of China studies, broadly defined, to come share their work with us. Today, we are very thrilled to have David Yang, Assistant Professor at Harvard Economics Department, to present to us his, I think, very innovative and interesting work on AI-tocracy, the political economy of AI. David's research focuses on political economy, behavioral and experimental economics, economic history, and cultural economics. In particular, he studies the forces of stability and forces of changes in authoritarian regimes, drawing lessons from historical and contemporary China. David has his undergraduate degree, BA degree in statistics and business administration from UC Berkeley, and also a PhD in economics from Stanford. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome David to present his work. And for the participants, please type in your questions in the Q&A chat box. We will reserve the Q&A session to after David's presentation. However, if you have questions for clarification that are important for David to address during the talk, feel free to type it in and I will do my best to give the question to David. So David, welcome.
Thank you, Winnie. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to present this actually so very much work in progress. So this is hopefully going to be part of a research agenda that we have, and I very much would like to hear your thoughts and feedbacks as we progress along. Okay, so the title of this project is AI-tocracy, and as you can see from the title, we try to understand the relationship between AI as a sector and autocracy as a political regime. And this is joint work with Martin Baraha from MIT and Noam Newcomen from LSE. So I want to start sort of a bit in terms of sort of intellectual background, that there is this, at least within economics and political economy in particular, this conventional wisdom that there exists a misalignment between autocracy and technological innovation. And this can come in various forms, such as sort of expropriation risks or lack of protection of property rights, overall speaking, in autocracy, induces sort of less investment from the innovator, because what's the point of innovating if it's going to be expropriated afterwards? It can also range us into sort of the autocracies themselves might hold up innovation because the innovation generates disruption to society that might induce loss of political power and political ranks from autocracies and so on. Okay, there has been a lot of speculations in the last couple of years in the public domain, suspecting that such misalignment between autocracy and innovation may no longer be relevant in the age of AI, especially as it becomes sort of an increasingly important sector. And there are sort of good reasons to suspect. So the people have argued that AI has become part of autocrats' new toolkit, that autocracies has always been wishing to control the population, and they have been doing so increasingly by predicting people's behaviors, and AI has been sort of an incredibly important tool to achieve that. Our own prior work has sort of documented that states has been a big player in collecting a huge amount of data for various functions, and that data has been used by AI firms around the world and in China in particular, and those data that state has collected allow the firm to innovate not only for the government sector, but the same data can allow the firm to be innovative for the private sector, which generating sort of what economists call the economies of scope, which can be important that benefits the AI sector's innovation trajectories. Okay, so what we want to do in this particular project is to ask the question, and from an empirical perspective, do we actually observe elements that support a sustained equilibrium between entrenched autocracy and innovative AI sector? And in particular, I want to break this down into two sub-questions, because sort of for a stable equilibrium or alignment between autocracy and AI sector to exist, we should have benefits run in both directions. Okay, so the first question I want to ask is, do autocrats actually benefit from AI, benefit from the AI sector and its innovation? And does the AI sector, in particular the commercial AI sector, not just the government sector, but the commercial AI sector, benefit from working with the autocrats? Okay. Now, answer to these two questions actually are not very ex ante obvious. The first question, do autocrats benefit from AI? Despite sort of a lot of the speculations, from news that you read these days, we don't have very strong direct empirical evidence that suggests autocrats' demand for AI is directly politically motivated. And we don't have, to the best of our knowledge, direct and causal evidence that AI actually helps autocrats to stay in power and generate political stability. Okay, so part of the goal of this project is to provide such evidence and to document this, hopefully in a convincingly causal way, that autocrats potentially do benefit from AI and demand AI in return. For the second question, does the AI sector as a whole, in particular the commercial part of AI sector, benefit from the autocrats? Now, you might imagine that the autocrats take advantage of AI in the same way that they take advantage of many technology that help them sustain power. But this need not be the case that, or induce sort of the AI actually sort of having direct benefits from working with the autocrats in generating more innovation. Okay. Even if the government's AI sector do benefit and actually do sort of grow after the government work with the AI firms, you can imagine several reasons that political motivated investments of the AI sector may actually distort or crowd out commercial sector innovation, because the pivots of the firms are focusing now to serving the government, and that's actually going to leave a bit of a vacuum in the commercial sector, which it's going to be the lion's share of the market. That if that's the case, that wouldn't sustain sort of this equilibrium between the autocrats and AI sector as a whole. Okay, so we're going to take a step back and try to answer these two questions empirically and see if they are indeed the case. Now, before I sort of show you what we do empirically, I want to sort of give you a very sort of overly simplified sort of conceptual framework or view of how, if such equilibrium exists, how they will exist and how does it work. Okay, so in a nutshell, AI sector or innovation in the AI sector is data intensive. That generating more output from the AI firm's perspective requires access to large amount of data. Autocracy demands certain kinds of AI software for political purposes, presumably because it allows them to predict people's behavior, or catch the criminals, catching political prisoners, and so on. And in the process of using AI to process data and so on, the autocracy is going to collect a large amount of data. The AI firms, when they work with those autocrats to process the data using artificial intelligence, it's going to be implicitly receiving access to a lot of government data because the data is going to pass through from server, for example, when they have to process it. And so there exists this ecosystem between the autocrats demanding potentially exists an ecosystem between autocrats demanding certain AI software, collecting large amount of data, and that data can be beneficial to the AI firms. Now, an important feature here is that when the data is now accessed by the government, data is accessed by the AI firms, and the firms presumably under certain contracts are required to produce certain services and goods for the government, the firm could use the exact same data to train a different algorithm or use the data to develop a slightly different software that's meant for the commercial market, that's the government don't directly care about. And this is what, again, we call the economies of scope. That means that there could be a limitation to the amount of distortion that's going to be generated in the sector when the government data flows into the commercial sector, because the commercial sector, commercial facial recognition AI firms, take an example, can use the same data to do facial recognition supermarket checkout booths that the government don't directly care about, but relies on the same data. Okay, so in that, to the extent that such economies of scope of government data exist and is large enough, access to government data could outweigh various disincentives for those commercial AI firms to invest and innovate, and that can generate, again, so part of the synergy and equilibrium. Okay, so let me be more specific about what we do and give you a preview of what we find, just in case I don't have time to go through all the results. I'm going to focus on facial recognition AI sector in China, And using the sector as a proof of concept and as one of the very important sort of frontier AI sector in the world, I'm going to document that autocrats such as China do indeed benefit from AI. That is, in locations in China that have occurrence of episodes of local unrest, that leads to subsequent greater investment of the local government in public security AI products. And those increased investments in public security AI products subsequently suppressed future unrest and generate greater political stability. Okay, so the AI software does seems to be benefiting from the local governments in China in terms of for political purposes, and local governments demand more of such as a result. And second, AI sector does seems to benefit from working with the autocrats. Here again, specifically what I mean is local governments. The AI firms who received contracts to work with local governments in China subsequently innovate, not just for the government sector, producing more AI software for the government purposes, but they're becoming more innovative and productive in a broader commercial market that government don't directly care about. That's going to suggest the existence of economy of scope, that the sort of the data and other resources that these firms, AI firms, received by working with the government allow them to take that resources and take the data as an input and be productive in a much wider market. Okay, these two elements is going to suggest sort of an alignment and a stable equilibrium where AI sector helps to enhance the autocratic stability in terms of the political stability, and autocrats' demand for AI can help sustain the growth of an AI sector and presumably growth of a much wider economy if AI becomes increasingly important share of the economy. And it can potentially bias the technical change towards the data-intensive innovation, which we'll discuss in more detail towards the end of the talk. Okay, so if I have sort of remaining time in the end, I'll also show you some sneak peek of some of the more recent sort of our next project in this agenda to look at sort of if this alignment between autocracy and AI indeed exists. Does this imply that countries such as China have a competitive advantage in AI sector? And what are the consequences of this in terms of global AI trade? Do we observe China being a net exporter of AI trade in the last couple of years? And how do we think about sort of potential sort of policy responses and so on? Okay. So without further ado, let me quickly sort of give you a overview of the various data sets that we used to help us to implement the empirical exercise, and then we'll show you sort of introduce the empirical strategy that we use for each one of the questions that I posed, and then show you the results. Okay, so to perform sort of to answer the question that I just posed, we have to sort of piece together, broadly sort of three different kinds of data sets that help us to sort of paint different dimensions of this relationship between the government and then the AI sector. The first data sets that we need to build together, and we build this from scratch for this project, is the sector, is a data set that describe public security AI investments and procurement by the local governments of China. This actually involves sort of piecing together two different data sets. We're gonna identify, to the best of our knowledge, sort of the close to the universe of all the facial recognition AI firms who have ever operated in China over the last decade or so. That amounts to about 8,000 of such firms, and this comes from sort of both a Chinese-based firm database and a US-based data set. Okay. We're then gonna put together a sort of I think this is very close to the universe of all the public procurement contracts that the local governments of China has ever issued in the last 2 years. There are about 3 million such contracts coming from the official source of the government procurement database maintained by the Ministry of Finance. Okay. We're going to focus on the subset of such contracts that's issued by the local public security arms of the government. So these include local police departments, local sort of bureau that help maintain political stability, and so on. There are about a little over 10,000 such contracts that sort of issued by local public security arm of the government and being awarded to an AI firm in our database. So that's going to suggest sort of a particular local public security arm of the government is procuring goods that's being supplied by an AI firm, and very likely it's going to be a facial recognition AI product, given that we're looking at sort of all the facial recognition AI firms here. Okay, so that's the first data set. I should note here that I won't go through this in the talk today. We could sort of as alternative look not just sort of the facial recognition AI software that the local government the public security arm of the local government is purchasing. We can also look at sort of AI capable surveillance camera, these kind of hardware that's accompany this AI investments through these contracts and so on. And then most of the results I'm going to show you is actually very similar if we also look at these sort of hardware purchases on top of the software equipment. Okay, so that's database number one. Database number two that we need is some measurements of local political pressure in which the local government might be responding to when they're investing in AI, and also subsequently the greater AI investment might help the local government to suppress. Okay, so we do this in two different forms. The first one is somewhat standard, the protest and the occurrence of other episodes of political unrest. This is coming from a global data set, GDELT, and we use the China version of this. It gives us about sort of 10,000 such events that involve sort of political unrest, protest, various forms of demand for rights and so on that occurred between 2014 and 2020 throughout China, which is the period where the bulk of our AI contracts is coinciding. Okay. Our alternative secondary sort of measurement of local political pressure, and this I will interpret very much as potential preemptive sort of demands or pressure for public security the local government might be feeling, which is the share of Uyghur minority population in a particular prefecture. This becomes quite salient from a local government's perspective since 2009, and we take sort of the minority share just from the statistical yearbook. Again, these are the local Uyghur minority share. It conceptually is quite different from the occurrence of episodes of public unrest, because to the extent the local government might be responding to the local Uyghur minority share, it's not necessarily responding to actual occurrence of the unrest, but very much potentially due to preemptive and sort of just a high salience of eagerness to stop any potential political unrest in the future. Okay. Finally, we need to have a data set when we look at sort of the economic outcomes, how AI firms are benefiting from the local, from working with local public security arm of the government. We need to sort of have a way to measure these firms' innovative activities. So for this, we're going to look at all the software releases that this AI firm has registered with the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology in China, which is required for them to release major software to the public. We're going to categorize these software into several ways. We're going to categorize them by intended customer, for example, whether the software is used by government, such as traffic control and public civilian software, or whether it's used for the commercial market, for example, traffic control for a supermarket, sort of checkout booths and so on, which presumably our government don't have a direct interest in. We're going to also categorize them by intended use, for example, whether the software involve components that relate to surveillance or monitoring, to look at whether that potentially pivot the AI firms to innovate in a slightly different direction. And to do this categorization, I won't go into detail today, but we use a machine learning algorithm where we sort of manually trained, manually labeled about 13,000 such software into different categories, and then we use the recurrent neural network to apply this labeling to the rest of the software, where we think our algorithm is fairly accurate in a prediction. Okay. So that's the three data sets that we have. A data set that links local public security arm of the government to their AI software purchases with these AI software firms in facial recognition sector in particular. Various measurements of potential local political unrest or pressure of local unrest that local government may be responding to, and finally the AI firms sort of software output, which again is the most important output of these AI firms. Okay, so now I'm going to get back to our questions. The first question: do autocrats actually benefit from AI? Okay. First, I'm going to look at demand, whether the local governments actually buy more AI software and more facial recognition AI software in particular through its public security arm of units of the government when they have sort of latent political pressure. Okay. When we look at sort of the variation coming from the local Uyghur population, the unprogress factor is going to be fairly simple. We're going to just look at, do localities with higher Uyghur population share experience greater public security investment in facial recognition AI in those localities. We're going to focus on regions outside of Xinjiang, just because the Uyghur share in Xinjiang region is a very different magnitude than the rest of the country. Okay, so this is, you can think about this as sort of any sort of factors that maybe triggering sort of local public security responses, and whether that's inducing a higher civilians AI software purchases. Okay, to look at the actual occurrence of the local unrest, we're going to ask the question: do episodes of local unrest in one quarter in a particular place, in a particular prefecture, let's be precise, leads to greater public security AI procurement in that prefecture in a subsequent quarter? Okay, there's going to be fairly sort of high frequency responses by the local government. We can do this in various ways. We can do a simple OS regression where we do essentially a panel fixed effect specification controlling for location and time fixed effects. But of course, one needs to interpret the OS with various caution in terms of causality because of confounding factor that may be on the background. So we could also implement an instrument variable strategy where we can instrument the occurrence of these local protests with local weather condition. The intuition is that holding fixed a lot of the potential local political demands on the margin, if a large protest or large episode of unrest breaks out, depends on whether the weather condition is favorable. If it happens to be a huge sort of super rainy or super cold, the protest may not occur just because it's relatively marginally more costly. Okay, so we can use weather conditions throughout China to predict sort of protest on a particular day, and we can be hands off in exactly what's the configuration of the weather condition in predicting the protest occurrence and using a lasso regression. And our first stage is fairly strong in the sense of, very much aligning with your prior extreme weather condition, such as thunder, hail, or very high temperature, for example, leads to fewer protests in a given place, just because it's marginally making it more costly for people to take it to the streets. Okay? We then take this first stage, aggregate up to the quarterly level, and we can see whether whether these protests that's coming from slightly more exogenous sources because of the weather conditions leads the local government to invest more in the facial recognition AI in the subsequent sector. Okay. So let me get back to the results on how local government with high share of Uyghur population in a given prefecture, their behavior in terms of investing in public security AI investments. What you see here in column 1 and 2 is that we find using in OS regression, places with high share of Uyghur population relative to places with relatively lower share, the local governments are spending significantly more in terms of investing in public security AI. This relationship is actually, if anything, stronger for the male Uyghur population, again, suggestive of this potentially pendant sort of pressure of preemptive public security of the local governments. This actually emphasizes it's not a generic minority share, sort of presence of minority phenomenon. If anything, sort of in columns 2 and 4, where we put the non-Uyghur population share side by side by Uyghur population share, we see a negative relationship between sort of high minority share leading to less AI investment. That's very much sort of is mostly driven by the places with high minority share tend to be also poor, and local government just not spending as much in terms of public security and high technology public security. But this relationship flips once you look at sort of the Uyghur share population, where again, given the public domain knowledge, where local governments do worry about the public security and sort of start to invest quite heavily in the facial recognition AI. Okay. To look at sort of the actual occurrence of the unrest and political protests, and how does that lead to governments investing in AI? What I'm showing you here in the plot is predicting the subsequent AI investment using the previous using the protests that occurred in each of the quarter, either leading up to the protest AI investments or after the AI investment. 0 is sort of the immediate quarter after. So the way to read this table, this figure, is that in the quarter where a large amount of local unrest took place, In the subsequent quarter, we observed a sudden increase in local government's investment in facial recognition AI by the public security arm. This did not occur previous to the protest occurrence, and it didn't sort of lasted longer than more than a quarter. So it's a quite sort of fast-paced contemporaneous responses where the governments are responding to the last quarter's protest occurrence and start to invest more in AI. That was the OLS regression. If I were to do this using instrumental variables, just looking at the part of the protest occurrences coming from sort of the marginal good weather conditions or extreme weather conditions that might discourage protests, we see a pattern that's very similar to the OLS version, where a high amount of protest occurrence indeed seems to lead to more AI investments by the local government. Okay. This is to say that local government demand more AI when there's unrest or sort of threat of unrest happening in the previous period. Now, do those AI investments actually help local government to suppress the subsequent unrest? That's the second question. Now, to answer this question empirically, it's actually not super straightforward, because there's going to be a lot of autocorrelation across protest occurrence over time. So just looking at over time variation, I just show you that the local governments are responding to high protest occurrence in the previous period, and high protest occurrence is going to correlate over time. So this is going to complicate how we look at sort of how the AI investment is changing the subsequent protest occurrence. So we're going to come up with two similar but different strategies to look at the effect of AI investment on protest. Both are related to whether AI investment is tempering protest occurrence with respect to a range of factors. The first one we could look at is whether we see a positive relationship between good weather condition and protest occurrence. Protests are more likely to occur when the weather is good, and when you're more likely to encourage people have large gathering. We can ask the question: does the presence of high investment in public security AI temper this positive relationship between good weather condition and protest to make it sort of less responsive to good weather? We can do this to do a similar exercise with respect to whether protests are less likely to spread when a certain place has AI presence. There's going to be a generic pattern that protests tend to spread across prefecture to prefecture, potentially because they share sort of latent political demands. And we can ask whether a particular place with high level of AI investments by the local public security arm of the government, when surrounding areas are protesting, does the high AI invested sort of local prefecture has a smaller chance of being spread over by the protests in the surrounding region. Okay. So this is what the regression results that sort of answer the exercise that I just described. The punchline here, let's focus on panel A, which is looking at sort of elasticity of protest occurrence to the local weather condition. Now, we see a very strong positive coefficient on good weather across any kind of local political unrest, or breaking it down to various different type of events such as protests, demands, and threats, and so on. We see a positive ratio suggesting indeed sort of good weather on the margin is more likely to induce a occurrence of those events. But the interaction between good weather and AI is negative. That suggests while the AI investment is not peeling off all the positive relationship between weather and protest occurrence, that relationship become milder in the sense of protests are less likely to occur even if the weather condition is favorable in a particular region. Okay, we see similar kind of tempering effect when we look at the protest spread over space, where when a nearby prefecture is protesting, places are more likely to also protest in the same period. But this sort of influence by the nearby region is becoming significantly less likely to happen when a particular destination prefecture has a high amount of public security AI investment. Again, suggesting this is pointing in a direction where when local government, the local public security arm of the government is putting in a lot of investment in facial recognition AI, it actually helps in the sense of very rapidly in quarter to quarter we start seeing protest occurrence start to be tempering down, and presumably this is exactly what the local government wanted when they put in that investment to generate more political stability. Okay. Finally, it's just this is quite suggestive, but we see some evidence that the investment of AI technology by the local public security arms of the government actually shifts the technology of social control and public security, broadly speaking. If we were to look at the hiring of the local police, we see that for the places that have high level of public security AI investments, in the next period, and here a period is the next quarter, local governments are hiring less police forces. So in some sense, the AI is substituting away from the ground force of the police. And among the police that they're hiring, they're more likely to hire office police rather than the police on the ground. Again, seems to shifting away from the putting a lot of the police forces on the streets versus more technologically aided kind of police operation. We also see that those public security AI investments is leading those those prefectures to have less political prisoner in the next period, suggesting a more targeted sort of crackdown or political oppression. This is not suggesting sort of fewer political crackdown, but just potentially sort of a more targeted crackdown, potentially aided by technology. And this is very particular in the political domain, and we don't see sort of such an active relationship between AI investment by local public security with respect to economic prisoners in the subsequent period. Okay, so that's the first part of the equilibrium. Do autocrats, do local governments in China actually benefit from AI? The answer seems to be yes. They demand more of AI when there's patent political unrest, and such AI sort of helps them to achieve better political stability in the subsequent period. Now, what happened to those AI firms who help the local governments or supply AI software to the local governments? Do they do better in terms of their innovation? To answer this question, I'm going to use a triple difference in differences empirical strategy. What that boils down to is that we're going to compare the cumulative software releases of AI firms before and after they receive their first politically motivated sort of public security contracts with the local government, relative to those who received a less politically motivated contracts. Okay, so let me be more specific here. So the three differences that we're going to exploit is that we're going to compare a firm before and after. So we're going to put in firm fixed effects. So there's always going to be the same firm, and we're going to look just a quarter before and a quarter after the first contract arrives. To the extent that different firms receive their first contract with the local public security arm of the government at different time, we can also control for the overall secular trend of this industry and explore that the first contract took place at different calendar time for different firms. And finally, to the extent that political motivated contracts might differentially benefit from certain local AI firms, because that might involve sort of the local government providing more data to the firm. We're going to look at sort of comparing the contracts that are issued by a local government that had just experienced local unrest in the previous quarter, or local government that has a relatively high share of Uyghur minority in the population, relative to working with local government that hasn't recently experienced any local political unrest, so any kind of sort of generic public security contract in that sense. Okay, I want to walk you through this. First, show you just sort of what would a average public security contract do to the AI firm. I'm going to plot different categories of the software right after the firm received its contract. So I'm going to start by looking at sort of, this is not actually an AI software. This is just data complementary software that allow the firm's releases and development of such software that allow themselves to store and transmit and calculate and process large amount of data. This will suggest the firm probably received, to the extent that the firm need to develop new software to store data, that suggests the firm received a large amount of data that previously hadn't had access to. Okay, so the way to read this figure is that what I'm plotting you here is within a particular firm, relative to the period before, relative to the period where the firm received its first public security contract with a local government, which is the red vertical line here. The number of software that it has released is every quarter leading up to the contract arrival and after the contract. Okay, so what you can read here is that there is no particular trend leading up to the contract arrival, but as soon as the first quarter of the firm has working with the local government, public security arm of the government, the firm starts to release more software that help them store data and transmit data. suggesting there seems to be quite a large amount of government data exchanged hands implicitly presumably because the firms are asked to process the data for the government. Okay. Now, if we look at turn our attention to AI software, the AI firm developed for the government, such as traffic control, population control, population counting kind of software, recognition software for the street. Look at that segment of the software. It can do the similar exercise. Look at the firm's releases of the software leading up to the first contract arrival, and then for each of the quarter after the contract arrival. What you see here is that almost immediately after the contract arrived, the firms start to produce more for the government. But this is largely potentially as you would expect mechanically, because the firm just are contracted to produce something for the government because of the service provision, and the firm is probably literally producing those software that the government is contracting and asking for. Okay. Now, what makes it a bit sort of surprising and quite important from an economic perspective is that not only did the increase in AI software production or innovation happening in the government domain, it also happened almost simultaneously in the commercial sector. The government contract wasn't explicitly sort of contracting about. Okay, so immediately after the first quarter of the public security contract took place, happening to the AI firm, the firms are also producing more for the commercial sector, such as again supermarket checkout booths, crowd control, customer recognition for retail space, and so on. This is suggesting a fairly high degree of economy of scope of whatever the input of the government data the firm has received access to from working with the government. The firm almost simultaneously are using that to either train a different algorithm or train an improved algorithm that can then take also to the commercial sector that benefit sort of a wider market on top of the government. Okay. The final thing I want to show you on the slides is that if we were to zoom in to the subcategory of the AI software that this firm is developing that involves some degree or some element of surveillance, such as monitoring and so on, we see an increase of the number of software that involves surveillance that these firms are producing in the AI space. This is sort of one of the evidence that we have suggesting that while the firms are becoming broadly more innovative and producing more productive after working with the local government, there is a sense of repivoting and potentially distortion from a normative perspective that there are more surveillance-related sort of product coming out, presumably because the initial data that they receive, the initial contract that they receive is meant for surveillance. And if not for the hard to know the counterfactual, but if not for the government contracting, the firm for the commercial sector at least might have produced less surveillance sort of focused AI goods than what they currently produce. Okay. The final results I want to show you before I open up to some of the questions is that now that was for a average contract that the firm received. They seem to do better after they received the contracts. The question I initially asked is that now what happened to those politically motivated contracts, the contracts coming from a local government that just experienced a lot of local unrest, or coming from a local government that have higher share of Uyghur population, for example, which potentially the investment of those AI contracts are actually sort of motivated by the explicit demand for curing political unrest. What we see here is that we wanted to focus on the 16th quarter after interacting with the unrest coefficient, which is suggesting that all the positive effects I just showed in the previous slides amplifies for those politically motivated contracts. So the firm who work with a government who are politically motivated when they sign those AI contracts differentially benefit from those contracts by producing more for the government, producing more for the commercial sector, and marginally pivoting a bit more towards the surveillance kind of product. So to tie all this together, what I show you is sort of several pieces of empirical evidence that sort of suggest this alignment between, and I would argue a quite deep alignment between autocrats' demand for political stability and AI sector's aim for data-intensive innovation. Autocrats benefit from certain kinds of AI product, and AI sector, in particular the commercial sector AI, benefit from working with the autocrats because of the government data they receive, generate large economies of scope that allow them to produce more for the various kinds of market on top of the direct demand coming from the government. This will suggest a stable, but I should be careful here to say that when this stable equilibrium, but this equilibrium could be distorted. this alignment between autocrats and the AI sector can overcome a lot of the sort of autocrat frictions on innovation that the literature has been pointing to for the last decades, because of the additional data that the firm is able to receive. And to the extent that the underlying economy of scope from government data is sufficiently large, the autocrats' demand for AI may generate greater growth for the sector. And to the extent that the AI sector is becoming increasingly important part of the economy, it might also generate greater growth to the entire economy. But however, the direction of innovation is going to be distorted, and the citizens' welfare could be reduced because of such distortion. Okay, so I'm out of time, unfortunately. So I want to go actually show you the sort of the results for the on trade, and indicating sort of China has a competitive advantage in AI, and China become a dominant forces in terms of exporting AI technology to the rest of the world. And I can save that for either for the Q&A or for another talk. Right. Thank you so much for your attention.
Great, thank you very much, David. Since you're on this point, actually one question is along a similar line, which is, do you think different political system in the US compared to that in China put the US in a disadvantaged position in the AI competition? It's not exactly what you have been presenting, but it might be relating to your last part. Do you want to just venture to answer this question?
Yeah. So I think there are two important points to make regarding sort of comparing, China or sort of any sort of similar country with similar political sort of institution with say the US. There is some commonality between them in the sense of across the board and throughout history, government is always playing a very important role in collecting data. And that's not uniquely true for China. Sort of when government needs to collect taxes or government provide any sense of sort of public security, large amount of data will be collected one way or the other. And to the extent that AI firms are starving for data for the innovation, working with any government is going to potentially beneficial to the AI firm to the extent that they receive access to this data. Now, there is a differential effect for autocracy in the sense of on top of the generic public security or public services that the government providing, they might have additional political incentive to use AI services because of a political sort of stability incentives and reasons. That's going to push sort of Chinese government or Chinese local government in the case of my talk having a greater demand than say the US local government. And that means more data potentially are generated in its force. Now, to the extent that there is a differential demand of the local government from China in demanding AI services and providing more data, from a pure theoretical perspective, that is going to suggest a competitive advantage of countries such as China relative to the US. Now, if actually let me actually just share my screen. I will show you the two slides I skipped in the end. Is that in our next project we're looking at sort of is that actually true in the sense of from an economic perspective, the most direct way to look at this is whether there is a competitive advantage is to look at who is dominating global trade in AI. China or US or any other country who we think are dominating the frontier tech. So we sort of collected the original sources on AI trade, and we see that China is by and large dominating global trade that involve AI products. 50% of the global transaction, cross-country transaction in AI has China as a country of exporting. And this is very different from all the other frontier tech that we're familiar with, such as biotech and so on. So AI seems to be China is very advantaged in the sector. And compare this to the US. The US is exporting quite a bit about its AI, but it's much less so than China. And again, this is very unique to the AI sector, and not the case for other frontier tech, where US on net is exporting more. So if you take this as a sort of evidence for competitive advantage, then yes, indeed seems to be that China has a competitive advantage in AI because it is a net exporter of this technology, and we don't see this in other frontier techs.
Well, we look forward to your next presentation on those results, definitely. But this is what you just replied is related to another question. The question is, your assumption is that AI firms want to have contract with the government because of access to the government data. But in the case of China, in fact, the private company like Tencent and all of that, they actually have a huge amount of data. Have you ever considered that there's also a incentive for the government to work with these firms so that they can get access to those data that they do not have?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I'm very much so far abstracted away from the existence of private data and focus on sort of, to the extent that working with the government has this benefit from from an AI firm perspective, access to government data. The private data was a bit on the background. And this is also an important factor related to the first question, that compared to say the US, the relative share of the government data versus private data in the economy or in the ecosystem could be very different. We don't have a good estimates of who has the lion's share of the data and who has more, but private data certainly is an important factor here. Now, the two things I want to emphasize when we think about private data is that even to the extent that Tencent and a lot of the large private firms is sort of big players in collecting data, there are certain data that only government has, and the government has monopoly over. For example, this is one of the reasons why I focus on facial recognition AI sector. Almost, at least in the foreseeable future, local governments, and to extent sort of central government of China, and this is going to be the case for most of the governments, regardless of whether it's China or not, is going to have control over who owns the street surveillance camera and who owns the video stream coming from the surveillance camera. So even for all powerful sort of private firms such as Tencent and Facebook, they will not in the foreseeable future have direct access or ownership over such data. And if working with street surveillance data is an important part of how they develop some parts of the software, they have to work with the government to obtain that data, because there's no other way, because you can't put up a surveillance camera by a private firm. Now, on the other hand, the government is certainly also picking big firms and big players when they ask them to supply their software. So there are, especially for those high profile local government who potentially have a lot of pressure for local political stability, they're working with some of the best firms in facial recognition sector, because they probably want the best kind of software. So they're definitely pick. When I say procurement, there's a bidding process in the end. The bidding is not very transparent, but there definitely is a picking and the selection of some of the largest and most capable firms. That's not going to be directly affecting some of the results I show you, because we're controlling for firm fixed recognition. This is within being the top firm, and you still additionally benefit and almost immediately after working with the government. But the background selection that I sort of skipped over is that these firms who end up working with the government, which is overall is about 20%, 15 to 20% of the firms in China, are 15 to 20% of the largest facial recognition firms. Small firms don't get to work with local government on average, at least.
Great. There's a question from Bill Shao. You have done a very interesting quantitative study of the political economy between AI firms and autocratic governments, and there's strong spillover effects on the commercial side. So the question is that he's reminded about the spillover effects of US military funded research. Have you compared the demand and supply of Chinese military research and its spillover effects, or is it something that you see a parallel that,
So empirically, we unfortunately don't. I mean, even when I say our procurement contract database is very close to the universe, I don't think we have nearly close to the universe, or if any, of the lion's share of the military-related procurement. Those are just not in the procurement data. So to the extent that empirically, can we say something about the military side? Unfortunately, so far we're quite limited. These are local police department, local public security arm of the government. That it could include local prisoners and so on when they're purchasing AI, but it's not. That's very different from military. No, the big picture question that this raises is a very important one, which is to the extent that working with the local government that generates spillover from the government sector to the commercial sector, a very close analog of that is indeed the military space racing would be another example where, in those cases, typically we think it's human capital carry over certain ideas of how to do certain things. And that when you help the government to build a rocket, that teach you a little bit of how to build an aircraft. And 10 years later, you work for Boeing, and then that spill over to the commercial sector. And we see that sort of in several sectors in the last sort of century or so. Now, AI sector in that sense, because of data is an input, and data has this economy of scope feature, which means that when you take the data from the government or access the data from the government, that same data allows to do things above and beyond what government directly wants you to do is. And that generated this sense of spillover that's quite mimicking the spillover coming from space race or working with the military. So in that sense, when we think about sort of the relationship between private firms and government in the AI sector, we're back into the 50s and 60s when we think about some of the headline sectors when they benefit tremendously from working with the state.
Okay, so there are 3 questions from Bill Alford. First of all, again, he complimented you on a very impressive presentation and work. His first question is, are there indirect ways in which the autocrats may help AI companies, for example, as in precluding development of new laws that would protect privacy more strongly, or in providing other benefits not directly related, such as looser application of regulation, access to finance? The second question, which is related, is does association between AI companies and the autocrats hamper the AI companies to raise capital outside of China? Third question, which is also a question another person have asked, is do local governments publicize their AI acquisition? The other person's question is almost the publication of this acquisition is a way to deter protest already.
So these are all great questions. So let me try to touch upon a couple of things that's raising them. First one is sort of privacy and norms and regulation regarding privacy is an important one, especially if you think conceptually that data is a key input into the sector, and what governs sort of the supply of this input in the economy is coming through at least parts of it, the people's norm towards privacy that governs how much data people are willing to give to the government or to the private sector, and the regulation that governs this. So this is sort of, again, advertisements of work in progress. We're in the process of trying to having sort of various sort of experimental tools to elicit people's privacy preferences around the world, in particular for the AI producing countries, and see is it actually indeed the case, as sort of a lot of conventional wisdom would suggest, countries such as China have a lower privacy preferences by the citizens. So we actually don't know ex ante whether that's the case, at least suggestively so. But we want to see see rigorously is the case that people are less concerned about privacy in countries such as China. Now, of course, that lower concern could be indulgence to government's responses. The autocratic government might have incentive to lower people's privacy concerns because that help them collect more data and survey better. We're also looking at sort of very systematically the global regulation in concerning privacy and data collection over the last 30 years. And that's actually painting a bit more sort of a complicated picture where if you look on paper, China has more strict regulation on privacy than the US by and large. No, enforcement is a separate issue, but at least sort of, there's an interesting, I think, interaction between norms, regulations, and how that governs the supply of data, which very much is what we're currently being working on. I think the second question about sort of AI, how does AI firm raise its funds from globally? I think so far we have one firm who are undergoing IPO, the facial recognition, which is also the first AI firms in the world who is undergoing IPO. So we're waiting and yet to see how the global financial market is receiving such a firm. There's certainly, I think, increasing amount of scrutiny by the global community regarding how the firms will receive the data and which kind of government services it provides. So I think this is very much evolving. But I think it's slightly less relevant, I think, from these firms' perspective in terms of the source of funding, because the ecosystem of the venture capitalists and the capital market for the startups are quite healthy, and if anything, sort of oversupplied in a lot of the funding. That there is not in the situation where their funding is constrained and they really need the funding from the global market. But on the other hand, sort of how do we think about, to the extent many of these firms are indeed global firms and they're going to become global firms through the global financial market or through exporting their products, think about trade-related responses and regulations is going to be quite important. And this is exactly where we're going with our trade projects going forward. I don't have an answer yet, but this is very much on our mind when we think about sort of the globalness of this phenomenon. Mm-hmm. The final thing about sort of, to the extent that local AI firms are publicizing their working with the government, I think a lot of it, they put this on the website. Many of them suggesting, working with the government, as I mentioned in the earlier question, is a signal for the quality. Local governments, especially sort of Shanghai local government, is working with the best AI firms. That's an indication of quality to the various market that I'm working with that government. So a lot of AI firms are not shy about advertising that. Local governments sometimes also advertising their AI equipment as Bill said, potentially for deterrence. In fact, there are reports out there that say that a lot of the AI cameras are not actually AI equipped, but look AI equipped just again as deterrence. But that's on the background. There, local governments are oftentimes quite open about their AI investment. I should say that this last point is actually about. And this is related to sort of the citizens' compliance and how they receive the AI investment, is that a bulk part of this AI investment is not going for political suppression directly. It is about providing public security to a certain extent, and to the extent that if the local citizens do perceive AI equipped camera is providing a safer street, that can generate a lot of population support. Now, of course, part of that is also going to go for sort of suppressing political unrest or deterring political unrest, but that may not be on top of people's mind for average citizen in China, and that's potentially suggestive of why local government is not particularly hiding the fact that they're using a lot of AI to that.
Well, thank you so much. We have a few more minutes, and let me just pick one question from Bobby Fong. His question is, what might be the conditions or circumstances that you will see the equilibrium to be breaking up? And how much do you think that the equilibrium, I'm paraphrasing, is stable? And what might be the forces that would actually break it up?
Yeah, so that's a deep question. I don't have a perfect answer, but I think if anything, I try to convince you from the talk is that the raw ingredients that we need to sustain equilibrium exist. That means you have benefits coming from both directions. Equilibrium wouldn't exist if only one party benefited from the other and the other party is a net loser, or at least don't benefit. That would be a fragile one. Now, so far, it seems like both parties meaning sort of the government and the AI firms benefit in both directions. Now, what will change the equilibrium is going to be that if the AI firms start to benefit less from the local government, because, for example, if the privacy norm or privacy regulation becomes strict enough that the AI firms couldn't use government data and the government data become less useful for commercial sector, that will mean that there's going to be less incentive for the local AI firms to benefit from the government and work with the government. That will tilt the equilibrium towards shifting. You can also imagine that if the local governments are having even better technology that's different from AI, that make them sort of sustain political stability even more cheaply. We don't know whether the technology will exist or when will that happen, but to the extent that might happen, in the next couple of decades or couple of decades, that will be a force coming from the government side that pushing away this equilibrium. But at least as they currently stands, this is not a statement about sort of numbers or quantity, but at least in the current stance in terms of the benefits going from both directions, I think it's quite stable. And I don't see a particular sort of trend in the immediate future where it might break this equilibrium. And that's what I meant by when I say there's alignment between autocracy and AI. It's a quite deep one, and it can actually overcome a lot of the sort of headline frictions that we typically associate with autocracy, discouraging innovation, because on net there seems to be this alignment and benefits.
Right. Well, thank you very much. It's time, and there's still a number of questions in the chat box, and I encourage you to write to David directly. I think I would just speak for David, I'm sure David won't mind. Thank you very much for this very innovative work, and I'm impressed with the massive amount of data that you have put together from so many different sources that allow you to answer new questions. And I also see that from your talk, there are a number of next questions that would be resulting from this current research, and we look forward to welcome you back again to share your work, and we also look forward to having you work more closely with the center in different aspects of it. So thank you everyone for attending, and until next time, bye-bye.
Thank you so much for having me.
Bye-bye.